The figures that we use, the statistics, the GDP figures, enable us to tell a story about how the economy is doing. Is it improving? Are people's lives getting better? And we already know that it's led us quite significantly astray. It hasn't embedded environmental sustainability, crucially, so we face a climate catastrophe. It hasn't looked at distribution, and so we have the kind of populist backlash we've seen in many countries. We need to tell a different kind of story with a different kind of statistics that really speak to people's sense of whether their lives are getting better or not. GDP is a measure for a production economy, an economy making things. And now we have an economy that's 80% services. This is really fundamental to economics. We paint ourselves as the scientists of progress. We're the people who measure what's happening to everyday life, the fabric of everyday life. And we're fundamentally getting it wrong if we just stick to GDP. So I think this is a really important agenda.
But it is a relatively new economic statistic, isn't it? I mean, less than 100 years old.
Dates from the Second World War, essentially. It's really interesting looking back into the history. Back in the 17th century and 18th century, what people cared about was how much tax could be raised to fight the wars that England was involved in against France at the time. All the way through the 19th century, nobody really cared much about the aggregate activity in the economy because nobody expected anybody to do anything about it. And it wasn't until the 1930s and the Depression that there was first any expectation that when there was a trade cycle, the government would step in and try and fix things. So that created the demand in the UK and the US to have a number that set out what was happening to the economy as a whole. They knew, how many trains were being manufactured or how many banks were going bust, but no total. So that started the process. And Simon Kuznets in the US, Colin Clark in the UK, started working out how you would compile an aggregate figure. But interestingly, they wanted to measure well-being, welfare, which is quite a modern, it's come around again in modern discussions, and not just activity. So Kuznets thought, for example, that advertising was a real negative and should not be included in his aggregate measure. Second World War intervened because the interest of governments then was to know what was the capacity to make stuff to fight the war and what sacrifice were consumers going to have to make to sustain the war effort. And so our modern concept of GDP, with Keynes as its father and his understanding of macroeconomics, that was when it came into being. So as you say, it's a really quite new concept.
And it's quite difficult to get your head around some of the concepts, such as if I got your book now and threw through the window there, the window would be destroyed and that wouldn't be captured in GDP necessarily, but me putting a new window in would. It would increase GDP, and things like defence or bombs going off actually generate GDP rather than being destructive to it in some ways.
Well, what's not counted is the destruction of the assets, the breaking of the window or the destruction of the buildings in a natural disaster. So that's not counted in GDP, which is just the flow of activity over a certain period of time. But then you do count the rebuilding, the guys who come and fix the window pane, that does count as part of GDP. So that's one of the paradoxes involved in the concept. It is a useful concept for macroeconomic policy. I mean, obviously the Bank of England and the Treasury, or their equivalents in other countries, need to have some idea of how growth is going to know how to set macroeconomic policy. So we need something like it. But I think we put much too much weight on it. And in the markets, it's one thing because you want to react to those short-term changes. But setting public policy by things that are not only going to get revised, but the number itself is within the margin of error of the statistics. It seems to me we ought to be much more cautious about that. It's not that it's not like measuring a mountain, the height of a mountain. There's no right answer. There are lots of judgments that go into how you define it and how you measure those different components.
Do you think that the GDP numbers are keeping up with technological change?
Now, you touched on a really interesting issue, and I think the answer is they're probably not. It's never been a really good way of capturing very big technological innovations. And the example that struck me was Nathan Mayer Rothschild, richest man in the world at the time, died of an infected abscess on his tooth in 1836, for which you could now buy an antibiotic for a few pounds to cure in a day. And how much would he have paid for access to that technology? So the sort of life-changing welfare effects of new technologies have never been well captured. But it's got worse because of the way the economy is changing. GDP was devised in the Second World War for a sort of mass production manufacturing economy, and it counts numbers of things. So to count the number of cars rolling off the production line is pretty straightforward. But when you're talking about a computer whose characteristics change dramatically over time, now they've got Wi-Fi and cameras built in and better screens, so you're paying the same money for something that's much better than a little while ago. How do you account for the fact that there's so much more variety in the goods, that you can customize anything that you buy? 3D printing is coming along. And then there's all the intangible value as well. And I think, as you're pointing out, they're just not very good at capturing that intangible element in a service-based and digital economy. I don't think we quite know what it is that we ought to be capturing either, because something like your travel agency example, that's a sort of pure efficiency gain, because the matching of demand and supply goes on better in these digital markets. And that's different from just not measuring something very well because we don't know how to make the adjustment for the different characteristics in a computer. And that's different again from something like being a nurse, where there are two possible definitions of productivity. It's either that you get through more people in a day, more patients in a day, or you get through fewer patients in a day, but you're caring for them better. And both of those might be relevant. For blood tests, you want to do them quickly and get through lots. For caring for a terminally ill patient, you want to have that quality of time. And I don't think we've got the concepts in place yet to come up with something different.
Well, that's